Hi guys, this is Shannon from Reptile Way. Welcome back to our channel. I've got a special guest, a baby black-headed python named Diglett. And as you can tell by our special guest, we're going to be doing a black-headed python care guide. So let's get into this video. Now the topics we're going to cover today in this video are things like distribution, habitat, their diet in the wild, captive feeding, enclosure dimensions, heating, lighting, humidity, substrate, and a shopping list as well. But before we get into all of that, let's start off by where do these guys sit scientifically? Now the black-headed python's scientific name is Aspidites melanocephalus, which is a bit of a mouthful to say, and where it sits when it comes to family, genus, species. So it belongs to the family Pythonidae, and if you've watched some of our other videos, that's the same family that the children's python is from. And with the family Pythonidae, Australia actually has 14 species of the world's total being 34. So it's pretty cool that we get the opportunity to have so many of these cool snakes right in our backyard. Now the genus it's from is obviously Aspidites, and there are two species in this particular genus. So you've obviously got the black-headed python, and then you've got your Woma python. Now both the Kimberley ranges and the Pilbara black-headed python differ slightly from, say, your normal black-headed python found in other parts of Australia, like Diglett here. And how they differ is pretty much from their head scales. So I'll put some information up on the screen if you're interested about how the scales on their head are slightly different. Now a really cool difference with the Pilbara black-headed python is it's incredibly lighter in colour. It's actually quite a stunning snake. And see Diglett here, classic traditional colours, you know, you've got your sort of darker browns, yellows, darkish yellow tones. Whereas the Pilbara ones, they're sort of yellowish tones, and even their sort of brown dark markings are significantly lighter, which does make it quite a beautiful snake. Now when it comes to their distribution, they're really found across a lot of the top end of Australia, all the way from WA into the NT, into Queensland, so they do have quite a broad range. Now their natural habitat, where would you find these guys out in the wild? Now these guys are generally found in dry, tropical, open woodlands, grasslands, shrublands, rocky outcrops. You really can find these guys in a variety of different habitats, which makes it pretty cool when you are going to do up their enclosure. It gives you quite a bit to work with. Now if you do go searching for these guys in the wild, if you want to find out their hiding places, they can be found in log hollows, rock sort of areas, crevices, as well as even termite mounds. Now these guys normally are ground dwelling snakes. However, myself going out looking for them, and also a lot of my mates, we quite commonly find them in trees. They do really like to climb, and especially Diglett climbs absolutely everywhere in its enclosure. I don't know whether it's a boy or a girl yet, so climbs absolutely everywhere. So what's really good again is just to see in their sort of baby enclosure, do they really stay on the ground most of the time, or do you see them climbing quite a bit? And in their adult enclosure, sort of put the things that it prefers in its baby enclosure. Check out the personality of your snake and build your enclosure or set up your enclosure according to what you see it doing most and what it prefers to do. Now when it comes to these guys' diet in the wild, very interestingly, they don't actually eat a lot of sort of small mammals like your mice and rats. Majority of their diet, about 90% of it, is generally reptiles. They even eat venomous snakes like the desert death adder. So it's really good to keep these guys around if you do have them near your property, because they can control venomous snake species. But majority of their diet when it comes to reptiles is obviously lizards. Now the results that looked into black-headed museum specimens and looked into their stomach contents Very interestingly, they could get a good idea of what their diet is out in the wild. So these are sort of the percentages of what they found in their stomach, which I find is pretty interesting because we do make a lot of assumptions when it comes to snakes' diets. And that research did emphasize again, 92% of their diet was reptiles. Now, the main part of their reptilian diet was lizards, and unfortunately they found a couple of my favorite lizard species in the stomach contents. So they found bearded dragons, blue tongue lizards, quite a variety of your common pets. So that's a bit of a learning experience. Never take out your lizards when you've got these guys out. Now, when it does come to captive feeding, when I was researching this quite a bit, because I've had no issues with my snakes really when it comes to feeding, so I do always like to do my research to see what problems people encounter. And Diglett eats like a champion, no issues. But say if you are struggling with getting your black-headed python to feed, it could have something to do with these guys' diet is mainly reptiles. So obviously when it comes to feeding your snake, we generally feed them rodents, things like baby rats or mice. Generally these guys, if they're babies, you feed them baby rats, and when they get bigger, you increase the size of the rats. But they may struggle to eat those type of rodents because obviously they eat a lot of reptiles out in the wild. Now, a way to combat this, or first of all make sure this doesn't even happen, is to make sure you get your snake from a reputable breeder who has had experience breeding these guys and feeding them. And if you are a little bit sort of hesitant and this is maybe your first snake, maybe just make sure that that snake has had about 10 good feeds and all on that same food type before you do take it home, and that could help a lot. If you are still struggling, you can actually put like scents on your snake's food to encourage eating. So I will have a look, and if I do find it through editing this video, I'll put it up. But you can generally get sort of skink scents or frog scents. I know in the US it's quite common to buy like a pack of all these different scents. You can try it on the food that you're feeding your snakes, and that could help them feed. Now, when it comes to feeding baby black-headed pythons, so Diglett is only about, I'd say maybe 4 months old or so. And so when it comes to feeding Diglett gets fed once every week, so once every 7 days. Once they get to about a year old, you can sort of mix up their feeding, and they can go longer periods in between their feeds. However, I have read some guides that do say that they wait until their black-headed python gets to 2 years before they sort of spread out their feeds. However, when it comes to feeding, you really want to feed according to your black-headed python's body condition. So there's a lot of conflicting information out there about when you should feed them, you know, how much you should feed them. And I did hear, because these guys are such good feeders, and a lot of people relate that to them being from a hot area, their metabolism goes quicker, so they eat a lot more. Well, obviously if you're setting your black-headed python up in an enclosure, you're controlling its environment and its temperature. So its metabolism is going to be pretty much the same the entire time. So you can see whether it's gaining weight or whether it's going to lose it in those conditions. And yeah, some people do state that these guys can be prone to obesity, fatty liver disease. So I have heard some people, you know, even once it's over a year old, they still feed it once every 7 to 10 days, but smaller meals, and they find that doesn't make them sort of gain weight, and it just keeps them at that nice steady weight. So that could be a good thing to do if you've got an overweight black-headed python. For me personally, I do like to mix it up. You can keep it, you know, relatively what it's like in the wild. So once Diglett gets to an adult, he'll probably get fed, you know, once every 1 to 3 weeks. And depending if it goes a longer period without food, that food content might be slightly bigger. And again, that's just a bit of enrichment, giving different size foods. When it comes to the feeding, there's a whole variety of ways of, amounts, the time you wait in between feeds, and you can still have a healthy black-headed python. The main thing is you just have to do what's going to be best for your black-headed python, whether it's underweight, overweight, perfect weight. Do your feeding according to that. And if you don't know whether your black-headed python is overweight or underweight or is healthy, you can go to the breeder that you got it from if it's a good reputable breeder, or take it to the vets and make sure the vets that you take it to does specialize in reptiles, and they can do an assessment and let you know. And again, if you are one of those people who are unsure, who can't just do it from visually inspecting it yourself, keep a log of those weights and you can pass it on to your vet, and from sort of the length and the weight, they can give an estimate just on that, whether it is at a healthy weight and how the food needs to be adjusted. Now, I highly recommend not to handle your snake several hours before you're about to feed it, and then definitely keep hands off the handling 2 days after it's been fed, so about 48 hours. And that's so it doesn't cause regurgitation. Also, if they've got food inside them and you handle them, it could cause damage to their internal organs. So again, once you've fed them, just leave them for a couple of days and let them sort of digest their food. Now, when it comes to the enclosure size, it is really something you do need to adjust as it gets older, and because you don't want to put a baby in a huge, massive enclosure that's suitable for an adult. You really do have to upgrade. And for me personally, I do 3 upgrades. So I have my baby sort of tub, where I try get about, I'd say, 5 feeds in it at least. And then if it's healthy, I'll put it into this particular size enclosure that I'll put on the screen, and I'll put the dimensions. And pretty much to see whether your snake has outgrown an enclosure, the minimum dimensions, if it outstretches its body, it outstretches along 2 sides. However, the best sort of size, where it's definitely got enough room, when it fully outstretches its body, it's just sort of the length of the enclosure. So this guy probably can outstretch the full enclosure, and it's got about that much left, so still quite a bit of growing room. It is going to go into a massive enclosure, which I am going to keep a little bit secret. I've probably still got a few more months of building, but that'll be really exciting when it goes into that. Now, I did just remove these from that little pot there because Diglet decided to go in it. So I think Diglet's getting a little bit grumpy, but still doing well. Now, the next topic we're going to cover is heating. Now, heating for these guys is very, very important. If you don't get their heating right, it really does affect their feeding. Children's are a little bit more easy breezy, and the temperatures don't need to be as high, whereas I find these guys need to have a bit of a toasty temperature. Otherwise you're just not going to get them feeding properly. Now, when it comes to heating, I always recommend do the heating according to where you're living. So again, I'm in the top end of Australia, which is quite warm. And as you've seen in my other videos, my children's pythons don't really need a heating source at all, only in sort of if we have monsoonal storms or some days in the dry season. However, with these guys, I do actually have a heat lamp for them because they do like it a bit warmer than your children's pythons, and if they're not hot enough, it really will affect their feeding, so they just won't eat. And babies do like the temperatures to be nice and warm. So again, always check the temperature of the room that you're in, and then get your heating adjusted, set up according to where they are going to be and the climate you're in. So when it comes to this little guy, you'll see on the screen it's sort of heating setup. Because the room is anywhere from 27 to 33 degrees, it's only got a little heat bulb, and that makes its basking spot still around 35 to 39 degrees. It does fluctuate a little bit, which is perfectly fine. So now let's go into these temperatures a little bit in depth as if you're going to set up your enclosure. So again, take this tabletop display as an enclosure. This side is obviously going to be the hot side, it's the highest point, and you want the ambient temperature of your hot side to be around 31, 35 degrees. However, your basking spot, the closest point to that heat lamp, will be a little bit hotter than that, and it's okay for it to be as hot as 37, 39 degrees Celsius. That's totally fine. These guys do like hot temperatures, especially if you're getting a baby. And then over here, the cool side, you probably want it to sit between 25 to 27 degrees Celsius. And if you're in a cold part of the world, a way you can guarantee your cool side being that temperature is to have it in a particular room where you can set the heating on 27 degrees. So again, that's going to guarantee that that temperature stays nice and constant for it, and the cold side isn't going to drop too much. Now at night, you really don't want the temperature to drop any lower than 22 degrees. And yeah, if you sort of do all of these temperatures right, you should have quite a happy, healthy snake. Now, UVB is an interesting topic when it comes to the black-headed python, because lots of people say it's not necessarily needed. However, I always look into these guys' habitats, you know, where they're from, when they're active, and their sort of physical traits to allow me to determine how can I closely mimic to what they'd be experiencing out in the wild. And say with children's pythons, they don't need UVB because they're nocturnal, they're active at night. So they're good not to have UVB. Whereas these guys, they're actually active in the day at some points of the year and then active at night at some points of the year. So they're not completely nocturnal. And also the head is black. It acts like a solar panel. They can stick their head out of the rocks to absorb UVB and to also heat up their entire body. And they think they sort of have a black head so they don't have to expose their whole body and bask and exposing them to potential predators. So considering all that information, for me to closely mimic the wild as possible, I do think UVB is sort of relevant for these guys, and I use it for this fella. And again, it's just a bit of preference. If you do potentially dust your food with vitamin D3, you can get vitamins for snakes if you're not going to have UVB. However, for me personally, I've got UVB lights because again, these guys are active both day and night, dawn and dusk. It really is just dependent on the temperature of the year sometimes. But again, you can do your research and look at some other sources. The two that I did really rely on were vet sources, and they recommended UVB. So for me personally, based on all that information, that's why I've got UVB lights for Diglett. Now, when it comes to the humidity, lots of the care guides recommend keep it around 50%, which is pretty spot on because the average humidity when it comes to the weather up here, where these guys are naturally found, is 55%. But obviously in the dry season, the humidity can get as low as 38%. In the wet season, it can get into the 80s plus. However, I found most people who are keeping them in captivity to stop any respiratory problems, keeping it around 50% does just fine. So I think we've gone over all of the basic information you need for these guys. So let's get into the fun stuff, setting up the enclosure. Now, when it comes to setting up the enclosure, obviously keep in mind you've got your hot side and your cool side. So that means you're gonna need 2 hides. And yeah, so you're gonna have a hide on your hot side, a hide on your cool side. Now also some people, I've seen a lot of US videos recommend a humid hide. For me personally, I don't have one because it is so humid up here. So we don't really need one because the humidity in the house is 50 to 70+% in some points of the year. But if you are in an incredibly dry area, and you find it really hard to get the humidity up in the enclosure, definitely pop a humid hide in there. Can be easily done by having a particular hide, spraying some sphagnum moss. Make sure it's just damp, so if you squeeze it, a whole bunch of water doesn't come out. You just want it damp to the touch, and that should produce a bit of a humid hide. Now you also need a water bowl that's big enough for these guys to completely fit and curl up in. And again, this just assists with things like shedding. So make sure you have one of those. Now also setting up your enclosure, you need to choose your substrate. So I'll actually put a list of different substrates up on the screen right now for you. For me personally, I like using our bioactive soil mix combination. So you can check out our bioactive video, and if you're in Australia, it pretty much gives you a whole ingredients list of how to make it and where to purchase it from. And I find this works really well because you can really control that humidity. If you want it more humid, just spray it with a water bottle. Less humid, you know, leave it for a few days to dry out. It's quite easy to control that humidity. The next thing you want to put in your enclosure is obviously things for these guys to climb, like sticks, logs, rocks, and this provides a variety of textures which really does assist when it comes to these guys shedding. Now just make sure if you are going to incorporate these things into your enclosure, like logs, rocks, sticks, you do properly sanitize and disinfect them. So for sticks and logs, there's a whole variety of things you can do, whatever's going to work for you. You can bake them, boil them, you can soak them. Personally, if I've got big pieces, I soak them in the bath for about 48 hours. And if you do have a big piece, obviously they may float to the top. So if you can put something heavy on it to completely submerge it, or you may have to sort of flip it over. And I use a combination of earth dishwashing liquid and bleach and really hot water, and that has killed everything for me. Now you may also want to put, you know, fake plants in there for enrichment, real plants. If it is real, again, make sure they establish, because this guy killed every single plant. So that's another form of enrichment. It provides cover, again, things for them to climb on. Now another thing to think about is a background display. Do you want to have a background display for your snake? And for me personally, with all of my enclosures, I have background displays because I think it just makes use of that enclosure a lot. There's not a lot of dead space. The snake can use that background display to climb up on. And for me personally, I really do advertise it. I think it adds a lot of value to the animal's life in the enclosure, as it can utilize that entire enclosure. And if you've got a small business that's near you that does enclosures and background displays like we do at Reptile Way, if you can't be bothered making it yourself, yeah, definitely go for that option. It is worthwhile. Just make sure whoever you're getting to make your background display, it's going to last a significant amount of time, and also it's made from animal safe products and they really know what they're doing. So I am going to finish up this video by putting a shopping list on the screen, and I do always recommend make sure you get everything you need for your black-headed python before you actually have it. And this shopping list will just make it easy. You can screenshot it, you can jot it down on some paper, and when you go into the shops you can sort of just tick everything off and make sure you've got everything you need. So guys, thank you so much for watching our black-headed python care guide video. A big thank you to beautiful Diglett here. Diglett did such a good job. And if you did find this video useful, don't forget to hit the thumbs up. If you'd like to see future videos, hit that subscribe button, and we will see you next time. Bye guys.